Welcome to a journey into the unknown. In today's video, we'll be exploring the unsettling experiences of those who dared to step into abandoned places that should have been left untouched. From eerie sounds in the dead of night to inexplicable sightings and strange encounters, these stories will make you question what's truly out there. These are real experiences, told by those who have faced something beyond the ordinary. So, sit back, keep the lights on, and prepare yourself for a collection of encounters that might just haunt you long after you've watched. My name is Lyle. I've been exploring abandoned buildings and forgotten places for years now, and I've seen things that, well, I still don't fully understand. Some people think it's a thrill, a kind of adventure. For me, it was always about the mystery, the history of a place, its stories trapped in the walls, the floorboards, in the air itself. But there's a point where curiosity becomes a little too much, where the unknown stops being interesting and starts to become something else entirely. I had been hearing rumors about an old factory, way out in the woods. It had been closed down for decades, the kind of place you'd only stumble upon if you were deliberately trying to get lost. It wasn't on any maps, and no one I talked to had clear memories of what had happened there. But the stories? Those were wild. People said it was haunted. Said the workers had vanished overnight without a trace. Some even said there were things still living inside that were not quite human. I didn't believe a word of it at first. I'd been to dozens of places like that before, empty, silent, long forgotten, but always with a sense of history. And this sounded like any other abandoned place. But then I saw it. The factory, hidden deep in the woods. It was larger than I expected, like a massive concrete beast, its darkened windows almost like eyes staring back at me. The forest around it seemed unnatural, too quiet, too still. It felt wrong, as though nature itself had turned its back on the place. I stood at the edge of the clearing, the factory looming ahead. I felt a tightness in my chest, but I shook it off. I couldn't let a few stories scare me away. I walked toward the building, the crunch of dried leaves underfoot the only sound. The rusted chain-link fence around it was broken in places, and the door was wide open. As if someone, or something, had been waiting for me. I stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, like something had been trapped inside for far too long. The floor was covered in layers of dust and debris, the remnants of machines half buried beneath rubble. The light was faint, filtering through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the space. The silence felt suffocating, as though the factory had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to disturb it. I made my way deeper into the building, my flashlight casting eerie beams across broken walls and shattered glass. It was hard to tell what was left of the place. The factory floor was littered with rusted parts and remnants of forgotten work, but there was something off about the atmosphere. Something unsettled. I reached what looked like the main office area. It was strange, the furniture was all still there, but everything was left as though the workers had just walked away. Papers were scattered on desks, chairs overturned, but no sign of any human presence. It was as if the place had been abandoned overnight. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft sound, barely audible. It was almost like a low hum, a vibration in the air. But it wasn't the wind. It was coming from somewhere inside the building, deep within the structure. I hesitated. I knew I should leave, but something kept me moving forward. I wanted to understand. What had happened here? Who, or what, was still here? I followed the noise, my steps cautious, trying to ignore the growing feeling of unease in my gut. The sound was getting louder, more distinct. It was like a rhythmic tapping now, almost like footsteps. But when I paused to listen, there was nothing, just the low hum again, deep within the walls. I turned a corner and froze. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was a figure. It wasn't clear at first, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and there it was again. A person, or something that looked like a person, standing completely still, facing away from me. The figure was unnervingly tall, its limbs too long, too thin. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from the pavement on a summer day, but this wasn't heat, it was something else. A strange distortion in the air itself, bending the light around it. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. And then, it turned. I saw the face, or rather, the absence of one. It was like the space where a face should have been was simply missing. The skin was smooth, featureless, and pale, as though it was a blank canvas. I felt my stomach twist, the instinct to run flooding my body. But before I could take a step, the figure moved toward me. It didn't walk. It glided. The sound of its movement was almost mechanical, as though its joints weren't quite right. The low hum of the factory seemed to grow louder, matching the rhythm of its approach. I finally found my legs. I bolted, crashing through the cluttered halls, hearing the echo of its movements following me. But every time I looked back, the figure was just out of sight. The hum was getting louder, more frantic, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found the door. The one that had been wide open when I first arrived. My hands were shaking as I pushed it open, the cool air of the outside world rushing in like a breath of fresh air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, hands still trembling on the steering wheel. I left without a second glance at the factory. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that place. I never went back, and I never told anyone exactly what happened. The idea of it still haunts me, the hum, the distorted figure, the way it moved. What was it? Was it a person, or something else entirely? I don't have any answers, and I don't think I ever will. But one thing is certain, whatever was in that factory, it was waiting. And I was foolish enough to disturb it. I don't plan on exploring places like that again. At least not for a long time. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. Now it's Victor's turn. Second story. My name is Victor. I've been exploring abandoned places for years, each visit an eerie journey into forgotten history. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered at the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It's strange, really. I've been to some of the most remote, decaying places, and each time, there's that brief sense of unease. That unsettling feeling that whispers, you shouldn't be here. But this time was different. This time, I knew deep down that I was in over my head. I first heard about the warehouse from a local who seemed to know a bit too much about the place. He spoke of it like it was a ghost story, casually dropping lines about the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, or the odd figures that people swore they'd seen through the broken windows. I was skeptical, of course. A lot of the things people tell you about abandoned buildings are just exaggerated urban legends, fueled by rumors and imagination. But there was something about his tone, the way his eyes flickered when he mentioned it, that caught my attention. The warehouse itself was in the middle of nowhere. I had to drive for miles along overgrown roads, where the trees seemed to close in on me. By the time I arrived, The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the entire area in an eerie twilight. The structure was massive, far larger than I had anticipated, and in much worse shape than I had imagined. The walls were crumbling, and the windows were shattered, with jagged shards of glass catching the light. The front door was hanging on its hinges, as though it had been waiting for someone to push it open. Despite the clear signs of decay, something about the place drew me in. The silence was deafening. There were no birds, no insects, just a dead, oppressive quiet that seemed to hang in the air. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and rusted metal suffocating. My flashlight beam flickered over piles of debris and discarded items, remnants of a time long past. The floor was uneven, covered in layers of grime and broken glass. I could hear the distant sound of my footsteps, echoing through the cavernous space. I moved further inside, trying to get a sense of the building. It seemed like the remnants of a storage facility. Old crates and shelves lined the walls, many of them toppled and half collapsed. But as I walked deeper, something felt off. It wasn't just the decay. It was the way the shadows moved. At first, I thought it was just the play of light from my flashlight, but no matter how I shifted the beam, the shadows never seemed to stay still. It was as though they were alive, twisting and stretching in unnatural ways. I dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a result of being in an unfamiliar, dark place. But as I continued down the hall, I noticed something strange. There was a door at the far end of the corridor. It stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness behind it. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a pull toward it, an urge to go and see what was behind that door. Against my better judgment, I walked toward it, the quiet hum of the building's emptiness surrounding me. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment. The darkness beyond seemed too deep, too impenetrable. But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, the kind of space that didn't belong in a warehouse like this. There was no dust here. No debris. It was clean. Sterile. And there, in the middle of the room, was a chair. An old, metal chair, rusted and worn, but somehow intact. The kind of chair you'd expect to see in a waiting room, not tucked away in an abandoned building. But it wasn't the chair that caught my attention. It was the smell. It wasn't the stale, musty scent of abandonment. It was something metallic, something sharp. Like blood. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but then I felt it. The sudden drop in temperature. A chill that cut through me, as though the air itself had turned to ice. My breath came out in a mist, visible in the beam of my flashlight. I looked around the room, my heart pounding. The walls, once plain and faded, now seemed to shift before my eyes. It was subtle at first, but as I stared at them longer, the outlines of shapes began to form, just out of reach of my peripheral vision, but clear enough to make my skin crawl. Faces. Eyes. Like something was pressing against the walls from the other side. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound. A dragging noise, coming from the far corner of the room. I swung my flashlight toward the noise, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, that the old walls were groaning under the weight of time. But the scraping came again. Louder this time. Closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. A shape, moving in the corner of the room. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form elongated and twisted. I couldn't make out the details, but the movement, the way it stretched and bent, was wrong. It wasn't human. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the air grew thick and oppressive. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting strange shadows across the room. The scraping sound grew louder, now unmistakable, a claw-like scraping against the floor, growing nearer, inch by inch. I don't know how I made it out of that room. I don't know how I got back to the entrance without turning to look behind me. But somehow, I did. I ran, not daring to stop, not daring to breathe until I was safely outside, back in the suffocating silence of the woods. I've never gone back to that warehouse. And I never will. The shape I saw in that room, it wasn't human. I don't know what it was, or if it was even real, but the feeling I had in that moment, the pure terror that gripped me, was all too real. So, if you ever hear stories about that place, or if you think about exploring it yourself, remember this: some things are better left forgotten. Some things shouldn't be disturbed. And some shadows are better left undisturbed, too. Here comes the last story, told by Francis. My name is Francis. I've been into urban exploration for as long as I can remember, the kind of person who finds thrill in uncovering the secrets of long-forgotten places. Old hospitals, empty houses, decaying factories, nothing has ever stopped me from stepping into the unknown. I've learned to expect the strange, the unsettling, and the eerie. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I entered that old, abandoned prison on the outskirts of town. The prison had been closed for years, ever since it was condemned following a series of riots and escape attempts. It sat on the edge of a thick forest, just far enough from the nearest town to be forgotten, but not too far to make it impossible for anyone curious enough to find. I'd heard rumors about it for a while, vague stories from locals who spoke in hushed tones when the subject came up. Most people avoided the place. Said it was bad luck. I'm not superstitious, though. I figured it was just a prison that had gone through some rough history. I'd been exploring the area around it for a few days, gathering information and getting a feel for the place. The structure loomed over the land like a ghost, with high, crumbling walls, its iron gates rusted and barely hanging on. It looked like something out of a nightmare. Still, I couldn't resist the pull. The stories, the whispers of it being haunted, there was no way I could leave it unexplored. The first time I went inside, it was late afternoon. The sky had already darkened, and the air was thick with an impending storm. I entered through a gap in the chain-link fence, careful not to make too much noise. The heavy doors creaked as I pushed them open, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness of the place. Inside, the smell of mildew and rotting wood hit me immediately. The halls were dark, save for the weak light filtering through cracked windows high above. It was unnaturally quiet, the silence almost oppressive, and I felt an inexplicable weight pressing down on me as soon as I crossed the threshold. The prison's interior was a labyrinth of long hallways and cramped cells. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floors were littered with broken glass and scraps of metal. The further I went in, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the decay that was unsettling, it was something else. A sense of being watched. It started as a faint feeling at the back of my mind, but it soon became impossible to ignore. The walls seemed to pulse, and the temperature dropped significantly as I moved deeper into the building. I made my way to the central area, where the cells were. Some doors were hanging off their hinges, others were completely missing. There were markings on the walls, scratches that seemed to have been made by desperate fingers. And then, I found something strange. In one of the cells, there was a small pile of old clothes, tattered, soiled, and almost completely decayed. But among them, there was something else. Something out of place. A small, child's doll, its face cracked and its eyes hollow. I remember feeling a sudden chill run down my spine. I didn't know why it disturbed me so much, but it did. It felt wrong, like an object that didn't belong in a place like this. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. That's when I heard the first noise. It was subtle, just a faint scraping sound, but it froze me in place. At first, I thought it was just the building settling. But then it came again, closer this time, like something, or someone, was moving around me. I put the doll back and stepped back quickly, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just my imagination. But the scraping grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from behind one of the cell doors. A slow, deliberate sound, as if something, or someone, was dragging itself across the floor. I approached cautiously, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but my heart was racing, and every instinct was screaming at me to turn around and leave. I reached for the door, but before I could touch it, I heard it. A voice. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help me. It wasn't human, not in any way I could comprehend. It was more like a whisper, a rasp, as if the words were being forced through something that didn't have a mouth. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, and for a moment, the world around me felt like it was shifting, warping. Without thinking, I yanked the door open, expecting to find nothing but a dusty, empty cell. But what I saw sent a shockwave through my body. The cell was dark, but not empty. In the far corner, curled up on the floor, was a figure. A person, or at least, what looked like one. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their hair was long and matted, hanging around their face like a veil. Their hands were pressed flat against the floor, fingers splayed out in unnatural positions. The body was twisted, as though it had been bent in ways no human body should ever bend. The worst part was their eyes. There was nothing in them, just hollow, empty sockets. But I swear I could feel them staring at me. Not with any human awareness, but with something darker, something that made my stomach churn. And then they moved. It was slow at first, an almost imperceptible shift of the body. But then, in one smooth motion, the figure raised its head and locked its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, on me. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat, and my legs refused to move. The scraping sound continued, and as I watched, the figure dragged itself toward me, inch by inch, its arms reaching out, its fingers scraping against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. I turned and ran, not daring to look back, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted through the maze of hallways. I could hear it behind me, scraping, dragging, getting closer with each step. The air was thick, suffocating, and I felt as though something was pressing down on my chest. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I left the prison that night and never returned. To this day, I can still hear that scraping sound in my mind, and I swear I can still feel those eyes watching me, even when I'm alone in my room. I don't know what I saw in that prison, but I know it wasn't human. And whatever it was, it's still there, waiting. Some things are better left alone, buried in the dark corners of forgotten places. I learned that the hard way. Each of these stories leaves us with more questions than answers. What is it that lurks in the shadows of forgotten places? Is it the remnants of the past or something far darker? One thing's for certain, sometimes, the scariest part isn't what you see, but what you can't explain. We may never truly understand what's out there, but these encounters remind us that some places are better left undiscovered. Thanks for watching, and remember, stay cautious, stay curious, but never forget the dangers that lie in the dark.